May 24, 1941. Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland. Captain John Leach stood on the bridge of HMS Prince of Wales as the range to the German battleship closed to 14 miles. Through his binoculars, he could see her clearly now. Bismarck, the most powerful warship Germany had ever built. 42,000 tons of steel, 8 15-inch guns, armor thick enough to stop any shell the Royal Navy could fire. Beside Prince of Wales steamed HMS Hood, pride of the Royal Navy, the largest warship in the world. Together, they should have been more than a match for any German ship, but Leach felt uneasy. Prince of Wales was so new her civilian contractors were still aboard working on her guns. Hood, despite her size, had been built during World War I with armor schemes that were obsolete by 1941. And the intelligence reports about Bismarck suggested she was everything Germany claimed and more. At 5:52 a.m., Hood opened fire. Prince of Wales followed seconds later. The Germans responded immediately. The British ships had expected to engage Bismarck's consort, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, first. But the German ships had switched positions in the night. The British were shooting at the wrong target. Precious seconds were wasted as fire was shifted to Bismarck. Then at 6:00 a.m., 8 minutes into the battle, the impossible happened. A German shell from over 13 miles away struck Hood. The shell penetrated her deck armor, reached her aft magazine, and detonated over 100 tons of cordite propellant. The explosion was cataclysmic. Hood's back broke. Her bow and stern rose as the center section disintegrated. Within 3 minutes, she was gone. Of her crew of 1,418 men, 3 survived. Leach watched in horror as the mightiest symbol of British naval power vanished beneath the waves. Prince of Wales was alone now, facing a battleship that had just demonstrated she could kill with a single well-placed shot. His ship was taking hits. Her guns were malfunctioning. He made the only decision that made sense. He broke off the engagement and retreated behind a smoke screen. Bismarck had won her first and only surface action, but the victory would doom her. The Royal Navy had just watched their most famous warship die. The Admiralty's response was immediate and absolute. Every available ship would hunt Bismarck. Every aircraft would search for her. She would be found. She would be engaged. And she would be sunk, no matter the cost. This is the story of Bismarck, the battleship that represented Germany's return to naval power and became the target of the largest naval hunt in history. It's the story of how one ship's brief sortie paralyzed the Royal Navy, how technology and tactics clashed in the final major battleship engagement, and how a vessel designed to challenge British supremacy became a symbol of the battleship's obsolescence. The Bismarck's origins lay in Germany's humiliation after World War I. The Treaty of Versailles had restricted the German Navy to coastal defense vessels, nothing larger than 10,000 tons. For 2 decades, German naval architects could only dream of building capital ships. But in 1935, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement allowed Germany to build up to 35% of British tonnage capacity. The restrictions were lifted. Germany could build battleships again. The Kriegsmarine planners faced a fundamental question. What kind of navy should Germany build? They couldn't match Britain's numerical superiority. The Royal Navy had too many ships, too much experience, and controlled too many bases worldwide. A conventional fleet engagement would be suicide. Instead, Germany would build a fleet optimized for commerce raiding, attacking the convoy routes that kept Britain supplied and alive. This strategy required battleships with specific characteristics: long range for extended operations far from home, heavy armor to survive encounters with British capital ships, speed to catch merchant vessels and escape when outgunned, and firepower sufficient to destroy any escort that tried to interfere. The design that emerged was designated Schlachtschiff F, later named Bismarck after Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor who had unified Germany. She would displace over 40,000 tons, the largest warship Germany had built since World War I. 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets would provide main armament. 12 inches of belt armor would protect her vitals. A top speed of 30 knots would give her the mobility to control engagement ranges. Construction began at Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg on July 1, 1936. The keel-laying ceremony was attended by Nazi officials who proclaimed the ship would restore German naval prestige. The construction took 4 years, delayed by material shortages and the immense complexity of building such a massive vessel. When she was launched on February 14, 1939, she was the most advanced battleship afloat, incorporating lessons from World War I and innovations in fire control, damage control, and armor protection. The armor scheme was particularly sophisticated. Unlike British battleships which concentrated armor over magazines and machinery, Bismarck used a distributed armor system. The armored citadel extended along most of the hull. Multiple armor decks created layers of protection. The underwater protection system used an elaborate series of compartments designed to absorb torpedo damage. German designers believed they had created an unsinkable ship. The main armament was impressive but not revolutionary. The 8 15-inch guns were smaller than the 16-inch weapons on the newest British battleships, but they were highly accurate with excellent fire control systems. The secondary armament of 12 5.9-inch guns could engage destroyers and cruisers. Anti-aircraft armament included 16 4.1-inch guns and numerous smaller weapons, though this would prove inadequate against aerial attack. The crew numbered over 2,000 men, from Admiral Gunther Lütjens, who would command the operation, to ordinary seamen manning damage control stations deep in the hull. They trained throughout 1940, learning their vessel's capabilities and limitations. Sea trials in the Baltic revealed some issues. The ship's handling in rough seas needed improvement. The forward turrets shipped water in heavy weather. But overall, the crew's confidence in their ship was high. The strategic situation in 1941 made Bismarck's deployment urgent. Germany had conquered France, gaining access to Atlantic ports. U-boats were savaging British convoys. If a powerful surface raider could be added to the campaign, the pressure on Britain might become unbearable. The Admiralty was already stretched thin, protecting convoys, supporting operations in the Mediterranean, and watching for German surface raiders. One more threat might break the system. Operation Rheinübung, Rhine exercise, was planned as a major commerce raiding operation. Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen would break out into the Atlantic, refuel from waiting tankers, and attack convoy routes. The sortie would draw British capital ships away from other theaters, potentially allowing other German raiders to operate freely. If successful, it could force Britain to suspend convoy operations or accept devastating losses. Admiral Lütjens, commanding from Bismarck, was pessimistic about the operation's chances. He had commanded successful raids before and understood the risks. The Royal Navy controlled the passages to the Atlantic. Their code-breaking was excellent. Their search capabilities had improved dramatically, and Britain would commit everything to stop a threat like Bismarck. But orders were orders. The operation would proceed. On May 18, 1941, Bismarck and Prince Eugen departed Gotenhafen in occupied Poland. The sortie was detected immediately. Swedish intelligence spotted them passing through the Baltic. Norwegian resistance reported them in Bergen Fjord. British reconnaissance aircraft photographed them at anchor. The Admiralty knew Germany's newest battleship was at sea, and they knew what that meant. The Royal Navy scrambled to cover the possible breakout routes. The Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland was covered by Hood and Prince of Wales with supporting cruisers. The gap between Iceland and the Faroe Islands was covered by other units. Battleships King George V and Repulse moved to intercept positions. Aircraft carriers Victorious and Ark Royal prepared to launch strikes. The hunt was on before Bismarck even reached the Atlantic. Lütjens understood the British would be waiting. His best chance was speed and weather. On May 23, the German ships raced through the Denmark Strait in fog and sleet. British cruisers HMS Norfolk and Suffolk detected them anyway, shadowing just beyond gun range and transmitting position reports. Lutyens knew he was being tracked but pressed on. Perhaps he could shake the shadowers once in open ocean. Then came the dawn encounter with Hood and Prince of Wales. The battle lasted only minutes but changed everything. Hood's destruction shocked both sides. For the British, it was a catastrophe. For the Germans, it was validation. Bismarck could defeat any British ship. But the battle had cost Bismarck dearly. Prince of Wales had scored 3 hits before retreating. One struck Bismarck's bow, rupturing fuel tanks and flooding compartments. The damage wasn't critical, but it reduced speed and left a visible oil slick. More importantly, it meant Bismarck couldn't complete her mission. She needed repairs before she could raid convoys. Lutyens made his decision. Prince Eugen would continue independently. Bismarck would make for Brest on the French coast where repair facilities waited. The decision was strategically sound but meant running a gauntlet of British forces. Every hour, more Royal Navy ships converged on his position. The hunters were gathering. The pursuit that followed became the most intense naval chase of World War II. Bismarck steamed southeast toward France at high speed, leaving the British cruisers struggling to keep contact. But she was still leaking fuel, still leaving that telltale oil slick. And more British ships were positioning themselves ahead of her course. On the evening of May 24th, swordfish torpedo bombers from HMS Victorious attacked. The biplanes, fabric-covered relics from another era, shouldn't have posed a serious threat to a modern battleship. But one torpedo hit Bismarck's armored belt, causing minor damage. More significantly, the attack demonstrated that aircraft carriers could reach targets beyond the horizon, extending the Royal Navy's striking range dramatically. Through the night, Bismarck continued southeast. The British cruisers maintained contact, transmitting regular position updates. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the pursuing forces from HMS King George V, was closing the range. By dawn on May 25th, he would be in gun range. Bismarck was trapped. Then Lutyens executed a maneuver that nearly saved his ship. He turned Bismarck directly toward the shadowing cruisers, forcing them to turn away or face his guns. In the confusion and poor visibility, contact was lost. When the British reacquired the track, they assumed Bismarck had continued southeast. Instead, Lutyens had doubled back northwest before resuming his course to France. The deception worked. The British were searching in the wrong area. For over 30 hours, Bismarck steamed undetected toward France. The British were frantic. They had lost the most dangerous ship afloat. Tovey turned his battleship southeast, hopping to intercept, but he was running low on fuel. If Bismarck wasn't found soon, most of his force would have to break off. The greatest naval hunt in history was on the verge of failure. Then, on the morning of May 26th, a Catalina flying boat spotted Bismarck southeast of her last known position. She had been heading for France all along, and she was now only 700 miles from Brest, within range of German air cover, close enough that British ships would have to break off pursuit soon or risk their own destruction. The only British force in position to intercept was Force H from Gibraltar, built around the aircraft carrier HMS Royal and the battlecruiser HMS Renown. But Renown couldn't engage Bismarck alone. The only hope was that Royal's aircraft could slow the German battleship enough for Tovey's pursuing battleships to catch up. Royal launched 2 strikes. The first attack nearly ended in disaster when the swordfish mistakenly attacked HMS Sheffield, shadowing Bismarck. Fortunately, the magnetic detonators malfunctioned and Sheffield survived. The second strike, launched at 7:00 p.m. on May 26th, would decide everything. 15 swordfish torpedo bombers approached Bismarck in terrible weather, flying through intense anti-aircraft fire. They pressed their attacks from multiple directions, forcing the German ship to maneuver violently. One torpedo struck Bismarck amidships with no significant effect. Another hit aft, and everything changed. The torpedo struck Bismarck's stern, jamming her rudders 15 degrees to port. Damage control teams tried everything. They attempted to free the rudders mechanically. They tried to blast them free with explosives. They even sent divers over the side in mountainous seas. Nothing worked. Bismarck could only steam in circles, her fate sealed by a single lucky hit from an obsolete biplane. Through the night of May 26th, British destroyers harassed the crippled battleship, launching torpedo attacks and keeping her crew exhausted and on edge. Bismarck fought back viciously, her secondary armament filling the night with fire. But she couldn't escape. At dawn on May 27th, British battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney closed in for the kill. The final battle began at 8:47 a.m. The British battleships opened fire from 16,000 yards. Bismarck returned fire, but her fire control had been damaged by the night attacks. Her fourth salvo straddled Rodney, near misses that demonstrated she was still dangerous. Then a 16-inch shell from Rodney struck Bismarck's forward superstructure, destroying her fire control and killing most of the personnel there. What followed was systematic destruction. Bismarck's turrets were knocked out one by one. Fires broke out across her superstructure. Her secondary armament fell silent. The British battleships closed to point-blank range, under 4,000 yards, and pounded her with everything they had. Shell after shell tore into her, ripping apart her upperworks, killing her crew, turning her into a burning wreck. Yet Bismarck refused to sink. Her armor, that elaborate protection system, kept her afloat even as she became a floating inferno. Tovey's battleships were running low on fuel and ammunition. The threat of U-boats and German aircraft was increasing. At 10:15 a.m., Tovey ordered the cruiser HMS Dorsetshire to finish Bismarck with torpedoes. Dorsetshire fired 3 torpedoes, 2 hitting on the starboard side, 1 on the port. Bismarck began to list heavily. Then, at 10:39 a.m., she rolled over and sank. Of her crew of over 2,000 men, only 115 survivors were pulled from the water. Hundreds more were left to drown when British ships broke off rescue operations due to U-boat warnings. It was a grim end to a brief but dramatic career. The sinking of Bismarck sent shockwaves through both navies. For Germany, it was a strategic disaster. They had lost their most powerful surface unit after only one operation. The sortie had achieved nothing except proving that surface raiders couldn't survive against British sea and air power. Hitler, already skeptical of surface ships, would increasingly focus on U-boats for naval warfare. For Britain, Bismarck's destruction was a triumph of coordination and determination. The Royal Navy had devoted immense resources to hunting one ship, resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. But the psychological impact of allowing Bismarck to roam free would have been worse. The hunt had demonstrated that British naval supremacy, though challenged, remained decisive. The battle also revealed uncomfortable truths about battleship warfare. Hood, the mightiest warship in the world, had been destroyed in minutes by a ship that was itself sunk 3 days later. Bismarck, designed to be nearly unsinkable, had been crippled by obsolete biplanes and finished off only after absorbing hundreds of shells and multiple torpedoes. The era of the battleship as the ultimate naval weapon was clearly ending. The tactical lessons were studied intensively. Bismarck's armor had indeed been impressive, but it couldn't protect against sustained fire at close range. Her damage control had been excellent, keeping her afloat far longer than any other ship could have. But ultimately, mobility had been her downfall. Without working rudders, all her other advantages meant nothing. The role of aircraft in the battle was revolutionary. Swordfish biplanes, dismissed as obsolete, had delivered the crippling blow. Reconnaissance aircraft had found Bismarck when surface ships had lost her. This foreshadowed the Pacific War, where carriers would prove more valuable than battleships. The age of naval aviation had arrived, announced by the death of history's most powerful battleship. German survivors reported that Bismarck's crew had fought magnificently. Even when their ship was a burning wreck, gun crews remained at their stations. Damage control parties worked until the end, trying to save their ship. The discipline and courage were undeniable, but courage couldn't overcome the strategic and tactical realities that doomed the sortie from the start. The debate over Bismarck's scuttling remains contentious. German survivors insisted the crew open seacocks to scuttle their ship before she sank, denying the British the satisfaction of sinking her. British accounts claim their gunfire and torpedoes sank her. Post-war examination of the wreck suggests both may be partially correct. The ship was being scuttled, but she was also dying from British action. The distinction mattered for pride but not for the final result. Admiral Lutyens went down with his ship, last seen on the bridge as Bismarck capsized. His final radio message to German naval headquarters acknowledged the inevitable. Ship unmaneuverable. We shall fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. Whether he believed in the cause he died for or was simply doing his duty, he faced death with the stoicism expected of a naval officer. The loss of Hood haunted the Royal Navy. Investigations revealed her armor was inadequate against plunging fire at long range. Her magazines were vulnerable to deck penetrations. The ship that had symbolized British power for 2 decades had been a beautiful but flawed design. Her loss led to modifications on other British capital ships, improving their protection against similar attacks. Prince of Wales, which had fought alongside Hood and survived, would herself be sunk by Japanese aircraft 7 months later off Malaya, proving again that battleships without air cover were vulnerable. The lessons of Bismarck's hunt were clear, but implementing them required time Britain didn't always have in the desperate early war years. The wreck of Bismarck was discovered in 1989 by Robert Ballard, lying in over 15,000 feet of water. The wreck is remarkably intact, sitting upright on the seabed. The hull shows extensive damage from the final battle. The turrets have fallen off, lying scattered around the hull, but the basic structure survived the sinking, testament to her robust construction. Examination of the wreck confirmed several things. The torpedo hit that jammed her rudders had indeed been catastrophic, a lucky strike on the one vulnerable system that could doom her. The shell damage from the final battle was extensive, showing that British gunnery at close range had been devastating, and the evidence suggested both scuttling and British action contributed to her sinking, validating both sides' accounts. The human remains visible in the wreck serve as a sobering reminder of the cost. Over 2,000 men died when Bismarck sank, most of them entombed in the hull or drowned in the cold Atlantic. The wreck is their grave, protected by international maritime law. Expeditions have documented it but leave it undisturbed, respecting the men who died there. Bismarck's story has become legend, inspiring books, documentaries, and films. The hunt captured public imagination because it had elements of epic tragedy, a powerful ship on her first mission, a shocking victory followed by a desperate chase, the crippling blow from obsolete aircraft, the final battle against overwhelming odds, and the ship's refusal to sink until the very end. It was drama on a scale that seemed almost cinematic. The strategic impact extended beyond Bismarck herself. Her sister ship Tirpitz would spend most of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords, tied down by the threat of British attack. Germany's other capital ships would venture out rarely, always aware that the Royal Navy would commit everything to destroy them. The surface fleet became a fleet in being, dangerous by its mere existence but rarely risking action. This tied up British resources. Significant naval forces remained committed to watching Tirpitz and other German ships. These forces couldn't be used elsewhere, exactly what Germany hoped to achieve. But it also meant the German ships weren't actively disrupting convoys or supporting other operations. Both sides were partially paralyzed by the threat of the other. The technological legacy was mixed. Bismarck represented the peak of pre-war battleship design, incorporating everything designers believed would make an unsinkable ship. Yet she sank on her first operation. The design philosophy that armor and firepower could dominate naval warfare was proven obsolete. Future naval supremacy would belong to carriers and submarines, not battleships. The tactical innovations were more enduring. The use of radar for fire control and surface search, employed by British ships during the hunt, became standard. The coordination of multiple task forces across thousands of miles of ocean, directed by radio intelligence and reconnaissance aircraft, foreshadowed modern naval operations, and the use of aircraft to slow or cripple surface targets before finishing them with surface action became doctrine. For Germany, Bismarck's loss was more than the destruction of a single ship. It was the end of aspirations to challenge British naval supremacy through conventional means. The resources invested in building battleships could have produced hundreds of U-boats. The crews lost could have manned dozens of submarines. The strategic miscalculation was profound. For Britain, the victory came at the cost of Hood and her crew, a price that felt too high even in victory. The resources devoted to hunting Bismarck, battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers pulled from other duties, demonstrated the threat a single powerful raider could pose. It validated the convoy escort strategy, but showed how thin British naval forces were stretched. The human dimension remained paramount. Over 3,000 men died in the Denmark Strait action and Bismarck's final battle combined. Most were young, trained for years, believing in their ships and their cause. The British sailors who died aboard Hood had no chance to fight back. The German sailors who died aboard Bismarck fought to the end but couldn't escape the trap they'd sailed into. All were victims of strategic decisions made far above their level. The survivors on both sides carried memories that haunted them for life. The three men who survived Hood's destruction watched 1,415 shipmates die in moments. The 115 Germans pulled from the Atlantic watched their shipmates drown while British ships steamed away. The psychological scars lasted decades, surfacing in nightmares and quiet moments when memory returned unbidden. In the final analysis, Bismarck's story is about the collision of old and new warfare. She was built on the assumption that battleships remained supreme, that armor and guns could dominate the seas as they had for centuries. Her destruction proved that era had ended. Aircraft, radar, and coordinated task forces were the future. The battleship would continue serving in support roles, but it would never again be the decisive weapon. The 8-day hunt from Bismarck's sortie to her destruction covered thousands of miles and involved dozens of ships and hundreds of aircraft. It was one of the most intensive naval operations of the war, driven by British determination to avenge Hood and eliminate the threat Bismarck represented. The success demonstrated Royal Navy competence and resolve, but it also showed the immense resources required to stop a single ship. Bismarck herself was an engineering marvel, the product of decades of German naval architecture refinement. Her design was sophisticated, her construction excellent, her crew well-trained. But she was sent on an impossible mission into an environment where every advantage lay with the enemy. No amount of armor or firepower could overcome the strategic reality that Germany couldn't control the sea lanes without controlling the air above them and the intelligence networks around them. The legacy lives on in naval doctrine, in the museums displaying artifacts recovered from the wreck, in the memorials to those who died. Bismarck's name became synonymous with powerful but doomed vessels. Her story is taught at naval academies as a case study in operational planning, tactical decision-making, and the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance. When the last survivor of Bismarck's crew died in 2010, it marked the end of living memory. The men who had served aboard her, who had watched Hood explode, who had survived the final battle in the cold Atlantic, were gone. What remained were the historical records, the wreck on the ocean floor, and the legend of the battleship that fought the Royal Navy and lost. Bismarck was a ship built for a type of warfare that was already obsolete when she was launched. She represented Germany's desire to reclaim naval prestige and Britain's fear of losing maritime supremacy. Her brief career demonstrated both the incredible capability of modern battleships and their ultimate vulnerability. She was the most powerful expression of a dying concept, and her death marked the end of an era. In the cold waters of the Atlantic, over 15,000 feet down, Bismarck rests, the ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, the weapon that was meant to strangle Britain's lifelines, the pride of the Kriegsmarine that lasted 9 days in combat operations. She is a monument to the men who built her, the men who sailed her, and the men who died with her. And she stands as testament to the truth that no weapon, no matter how powerful, can overcome strategic impossibility. The hunt for Bismarck was won before she ever left port. Her fate was sealed by geography, technology, and the mathematics of naval power. What remained was only the tragic working out of the inevitable.